Did you know that one man, alone, stopped global nuclear war in 1962? That man was Soviet submarine officer, 36-year-old Vasili Arkhipov.
This is the story of how he saved the world.
NBC News brings to you from the White House in Washington an address by President Kennedy declared to be officially of the highest national urgency. Mr. Kennedy met today with the National Security Council. He conferred with leaders of Congress rushed back to Washington by Air Force jet, the President of the United States.
In the now historic televised address, JFK announced the U.S. government had recently discovered evidence of new nuclear missile launch sites in Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States.
Has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Things got serious, fast. Kennedy signed an order effectuating a naval blockade of Cuba the very next day. In defiance of the blockade order, 25 Soviet ships, some believed to be carrying nuclear missiles, continued towards Cuba. Fearing war was imminent, President Kennedy consulted his Deputy Secretary of Defense on how to best fire at Soviet vessels.
But as I understood, there's some report that the Russian ships were not going to stop, and we were going to have to sink them. In order to stop them, I thought that we were going to have to fire on them. I was wondering whether the instructions on how that's to be done, or where they're to be shot at and so on, to cause the minimum of damage. And in addition, if they're boarded, it's very possible the Russians will fire at them as they board, and we'd have to fire back and have quite a slaughter.
Despite this grim talk, the next day it appeared for a moment as if diplomacy was prevailing.
Good evening, this is Walter Cronkite at CBS News headquarters in New York. Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba. But there has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation.
However, the negotiations went nowhere, and tensions continued to rise. Kennedy and Khrushchev, then head of the Soviet Union, exchanged a series of heated letters. Then, on October 27, American pilot Rudolph Anderson and his U-2 spy plane were shot down over Cuba on the orders of 2 Soviet generals stationed on the island. While many in the immediate aftermath thought this attack might launch World War III, it actually ended up serving as a turning point, as Kennedy and Khrushchev both realized things were spiraling out of control and became more open to negotiation.
What neither man knew, what the entire world didn't know, is that the most important event that day didn't take place thousands of feet in the air, but rather, thousands of feet underwater, in a Soviet B-59 submarine. On this fateful day, the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Randolph, along with a fleet of destroyers, cornered the B-59 submarine, which been submerged and without radio communication for days. The American ships began to drop depth charges, in an attempt to get the submarine to surface and surrender. According to one of the men on board, Vadim Orlov, it felt like he was sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer. The situation inside the submarine was dire, to put it mildly. The air conditioning system malfunctioned, causing temperatures inside the vessel to rise to 50 degrees Celsius, or 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
As the crew members tried desperately to avoid the depth charges, the vessel's oxygen systems began to break down, the air became barely breathable, and the men started fainting with regularity. While the American sailors may have felt confident at this point that they had gained the upper hand in this showdown, they didn't know 2 critical facts about the Soviet B-59 submarine below them. 1.
it was equipped with a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, and 2, it had permission to launch it without confirmation from Moscow. 2 out of the 3 submarine senior officers, including the captain, Valentin Savitsky, wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo. According to living crew members, Savitsky yelled, "We're gonna blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." Savitsky ordered the torpedo to be armed and readied, telling his crew he believed war with the United States had already begun. However, Savitsky didn't possess unilateral authority to order the launch. To fire the nuclear torpedo, he needed the permission of Flotilla Chief of Staff, Vasili Arkhipov, the hero of this story. Arkhipov had experience managing underwater nuclear emergencies. Just a year before, in 1961, while commanding the Soviet K-19 submarine off the coast of Greenland, the sub's nuclear-powered cooling system began to leak radioactive material. Arkhipov was able to lead his men through the situation and prevent nuclear meltdown, but he and the crew were exposed to substantial amounts of radiation. All 7 members of the engineering crew that worked directly on the leak died within a month. Only a year removed from this harrowing event, with a body full of radiation, it had fallen on the shoulders of Vasili Arkhipov to save the world from nuclear disaster once again. Savitsky insisted to Arkhipov that they launch the torpedo, now, before they died from oxygen deprivation. He was joined by the political officer on board, Ivan Maslenikov, who was equally insistent. It's worth noting that most nuclear torpedo-equipped Russian submarines were authorized to fire with just the approval of the captain and political officer. However, Soviet military code dictated that when a flotilla chief of staff was on board, their approval was required as well before a launch could be ordered. This caveat in Soviet chain of command may have just saved the world from nuclear winter. Despite Savitsky's cries of insistence, Arkhipov refused to sanction the launch of the nuclear torpedo. Despite the heat, oxygen deprivation, and the immense pressure of the situation, he kept a level head. Instead, he ordered the submarine to surface, which it did a few minutes later. The American ships did not attack the submarine or even board it, and all Soviet personnel on board survived. If the B-59 had launched its nuclear torpedo, given the tensions and the bloated nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union, historians agree that this likely would have led to full-scale global nuclear war, and the end of life on Earth. Thank you, Vasili Arkhipov, for saving the world.